So last week on the Folklore Tree, we talked in a little more detail about folk groups. This week we're going to discuss some of the genres of folklore, how they're used to categorize the different things that folklorists study, and the advantages and disadvantages of using genre for classification. You've almost certainly encountered genres in your own everyday life, using them to find what you want in bookstores and music stores. Folklorists use genre in a similar way, though as I'm sure you've come to notice by now, it's not always as simple as sorting all your material into neat little boxes. Just like in other fields like music and literature, folklorists use genres to organize the things they study into a few recognizable categories. Lynne S. McNeill's book Folklore Rules breaks genre down into 4 main overarching categories. Things we say, like jokes, folktales, myths, legends, and songs. Things we do, like calendar, customs, rituals, games, or dances. Things we make, like handmade objects, collections, or architecture. And things we believe, like superstition, folk religion, and supernatural creatures. For the sake of brevity, we are going to refer to these genres as verbal folklore, custom, material culture, and folk beliefs for the rest of the series. Each of these 4 main genres can be split into a variety of subgenres, and sometimes divided into yet more genres after that. Verbal folklore alone, for example, can contain everything from myths and legends and folk tales, jokes, personal experience narratives and memorats, ballads and songs, expressions like slang, proverbs, and greetings. The list goes on. I hope to be able to discuss many of these things in more detail later on in the series, but to keep this video from ending up like 30 minutes long, we're gonna keep descriptions here fairly brief. Verbal genres are a pretty good place to start, especially since that's what most people think of immediately when they think of folklore. There's only about a bazillion genres of verbal folklore, and that can even include things like certain types of music, mostly songs. We'll talk more about that stuff later, but in this video I want to talk about what I call the big 4. Myths, legends, folktales, aka Märchen, and personal experience narratives, which we are going to call PENs for short. The terms myth, legend, and folktale are often used interchangeably in popular culture, but to folklorists they actually mean very different things. Folktales are stories that are told specifically for entertainment and are understood to be fictional. Most people tend to think of folktales as being told specifically for children, but that's actually a very recent development. Before the people of the Victorian era started collecting, and also altering them to better fit certain Victorian values, I'm looking at you, Brothers Grimm, folktales were told by adults for other adults the majority of the time. Kids could listen if they want to, but they weren't the intended audience. Pretty much anyone can identify a folktale, mostly because they usually start and end with formulaic phrases. Think, once upon a time, and they all lived happily ever after. Now, myths are a bit trickier to discuss because the word is often used as a synonym for lie, like so many other things in folklore, as I'm sure you've noticed by now. Now, for folklorists, that's definitely not the case. Myths are, in fact, fundamental truths. They're sacred in nature and usually religious. Now, based on this definition, folklorists don't just count the stuff that most people think of mythology, like classical Greek or Roman mythology, but also contemporary religions like Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and the various forms of contemporary paganism. So you can see why it can get kind of messy to refer to such deeply held impersonal belief systems as myths. So let's just dispense with the popular usage of the term myth and talk about how folklorists classify myths. Now, to folklorists, myths are sacred to particular groups and are always told as if they are true. They tell the origins of the group, contain fundamental truths significant to them, and help to shape and explain their worldviews. Folktales and myths do share some similarities. They often involve unexplainable events, attributed to magic in folktale and the divine in myth. They're set in a time outside of time, a fictional world in folktale, and a primordial version of our world in myths. And they are usually only told by certain people in a community. For folktales, particularly skilled storytellers, and for myths, an authority figure who's extensively studied the sacred texts. However, myths are differentiated from folktales because they are always understood to be true, whereas folktales are always understood to be fictional. This is just yet another instance where it's important to consider context. How many times have I mentioned context since this series started? I feel like I should start a counter, or a drinking game. Now, legends are a bit different from both myths and folktales because they tend to sit somewhere in between. They are not always understood to be true, literally or fundamentally, but they are told as though they are. Legends also have a recognizable setting in the contemporary world, or at least contemporary to the teller's world wherever and whenever they happen to be telling it. I mean, historical legends are a thing too. Many legends also act as cautionary tales about health and safety, especially in the cases of legends about mass production of food, or maybe businesses whose standards aren't quite up to snuff. This is especially the case with contemporary legends, which you have probably heard of but referred to as urban legends. However, calling them contemporary legends is a bit more inclusive of different contexts, so we're gonna go with that term instead. Legends can also be told by anybody, whereas myths and folktales tend to be told by specific people in a community, and are usually only told to like 1 or 2 people at a time, rather than by one person to a larger audience. This also enables the teller and the listener to negotiate the truth of a legend through more personal interaction. Different types of narratives also rise rise and fall in popularity over time. Legends are currently the most actively circulating form of narrative, and not just person to person, but online. Personal experience narratives, or PENs, however, don't circulate in quite the same way. PENs are pretty much exactly what they sound like. The stories people tell about their own lives and how they experience the world. I can almost certainly guarantee you've told one. Because PENs are, by definition, personal stories, once they start getting circulated by someone other than the original teller, they stop being PENs and start being other types of third-person narrative. Though it's good to note that many local legends often start as PENs, especially if they concern local characters. But we're going to come back to all this later. For now, let's move on. Things we do, which we are going to call custom from now on, can include all sorts of things. Holiday traditions like putting up a Christmas tree or lighting a menorah. Gestures like giving a thumbs up or flipping someone off. I'm not going to do that, by the way. Rituals like initiations or rites of passage, or even just going to weekly book club meetings. Celebrations like birthday parties. Dances like the waltz or the Macarena. Games like capture the flag or tag or strip poker. You get the point. The important thing is that they are part of our everyday lives and we learn them through informal means. That is to say, person to person, for those of you who forgot or fell asleep. The main things that make custom different from other types of folklore is that they require some sort of physical participation, and we learn them by observing others. And they're a lot easier to learn and learn about by watching and participating instead of just reading about them in a book. They're also really neat to study because they involve a combination of traditional values and personal preferences. We usually just call these aesthetics. And they might change between individual performances. You might as well just add performance and aesthetics to the list of words you're going to be hearing a lot, right under context. Let's go to the whiteboard for this next one. Customary celebrations can further be divided into two main groups, calendar customs and rites of passage. Both have very specific relationships to time. Calendar customs happen over and over and coincide with particular times of year and or the seasons. They might happen yearly, like holidays, quarterly, like solstices and equinoxes, monthly, weekly, maybe even daily. Calendar customs help give us a sense of consistency in life over extended periods of time. Rites of passage are different because they happen linearly rather than cyclically, and they take place over the course of individual lifetimes. Things like birth rites, death rites, graduation, marriage, and so on. They highlight the transitions that we make as we grow up in age. Both types of customs might be based purely on cultural constructions, things like Canada Day, which was created by the institution of government, or on natural cycles, biological or otherwise, that would happen regardless, like children growing up, the seasons changing, etc., etc. Material culture. It's fun because you can touch it. Get your heads out of the gutter. Most of the genres folklorists study are intangible. That is to say, they aren't physical, you can't touch it. It's like Danny Phantom when he goes ghost. That show got cancelled years ago. Is anyone even gonna get that reference? Material culture is made up of the physical stuff people use to perform or express their cultural identity. Most people think of things like folk art and crafts, handmade products essentially. And these are probably the most widely studied forms of material culture. Things like furniture, clothing, decorative cross-stitching, pottery, and so on. However, it can also include things like vernacular architecture, heirlooms, or creations made out of found materials like buttons or old machine parts. A lot of the study of material culture surrounds things that are both expressive and utilitarian. That is to say, you use them to perform specific tasks. For most of human history, if you wanted or needed something, whether that be a toy or a tool, you had to make it yourself. Think of the crafting function in pretty much every survival video game ever made. You need a Molotov cocktail to explode some zombies, you gotta make it yourself. Today, of course, you can buy pretty much everything you want or need commercially, and most of the stuff that we make by hand today is decidedly non-utilitarian. Many of these things are made up of reused objects. For example, I have a friend who makes steampunk jewelry out of watch parts. This is just one of the ways that mass-produced products, which are decidedly non-folkloristic, can be transformed into folk objects. Material culture can also be expressed by making collections, or assemblages if you want to be fancy. They might be compiled by a single person, like my old collection of Pokemon cards, or by many people, like the collections of tokens sometimes left at grave and memorial sites. An object, whether mass-produced or one of a kind, can also become traditional by getting passed around from person to person a lot. This might be like a treasured family heirloom, or that annoying gag gift that gets passed around every year at Christmas. As you might be starting to piece together by now, there's a few main patterns we can use to identify folk objects. Patterns of use, patterns of creation, and patterns of passing on. They're pretty much exactly what they sound like. Even though material culture is, well, material. It's defined as folklore in pretty much the same way as its non-material counterparts, by the context in which people make it, use it, and pass it on. Material culture does tend to last longer in a fixed state, though, by virtue of being a physical object, and of course physical objects are much easier to preserve than spoken words. However, it's also a lot more difficult to observe the dynamic variation that is also a characteristic of folklore. See the first video in this series in case you forgot. Finally, we're going to talk about folk beliefs. We've already talked a little bit about this in this video and in previous videos, but it's important to to remember, so I'm going to say it again. Just because something qualifies as folklore does not make it untrue. In fact, whether a piece of folklore is true is beside the point. That's not why folklorists study it. What is interesting is who transmits it, why they transmit it, and how it stays in circulation for so long. That being said, in the early development of folklore scholarship, folklorists would use folk beliefs, especially anything relating to the supernatural, to justify claiming superiority over the people they studied. Also, it was assumed that as scientific awareness increased, people would start to abandon their supernatural beliefs. As you've probably gathered from all the reality TV shows about hunting ghosts and finding Sasquatch, this has largely not been the case. There are two main hypotheses relating to why people still hold on to their supernatural beliefs. Cultural source hypothesis states that a person who still ascribes to supernatural beliefs does so because their culture says that it is true. Experiential source hypothesis states that if a person has had their own supernatural experience, they will probably hold supernatural beliefs, and that this is the case even if they never believed in the supernatural before having had the experience. However, it is important to remember that these hypotheses, like pretty much everything else we've talked about so far, have their flaws. Experiential source hypothesis in particular has its limits. This is mainly because even if a person has their own supernatural experience, the way that they describe that experience to others is going to be restricted by the limits of their language and the culture that produced that language. It's not a topic I'm going to cover in depth right now, mainly to keep this video from running ridiculously long. In any case, it is important to remember that not everyone who believes in the supernatural is inherently crazy or irrational. People can rationally perceive a very real situation, but may not have the ability or the vocabulary to verify or explain what happened to them. This was once the case with sleep paralysis. It used to be explained as attacks on sleeping people by supernatural creatures, such as the old hag, as it is sometimes called in Newfoundland, but is now understood to be a natural, if very rare, biological condition. However, explaining it as a supernatural phenomenon was the only way that people had to understand it prior to certain scientific advances in education. Folk beliefs can be useful in other fields too. The discovery of the giant squid by Frederick Aldrich, for example, was made possible because he studied the stories of people who had witnessed it. Previously, the giant squid was just explained away as an imaginary creature who was only believed in by the people of rural fishing villages. Now, obviously, not all folk beliefs can be scientifically verified. The point is that dismissing folk beliefs out of hand is not conducive to their study. Now, we've talked a lot about genres and how they help us study folklore, but they also present a lot of challenges. For example, a friendship bracelet is obviously material culture, but it might also be part of a larger gift-giving tradition, which is a custom, or given as a good luck charm, which is a folk belief. Now, while many fit into multiple categories, others might not fit into any at all. Songs are often classified by folklorists as a form of verbal culture, but what about other types of music? Now, instruments can count as material culture, but what about the music that gets played on them? Does that count as verbal folklore as songs do, or is it something else entirely? Now, genres help keep us organized and enable us to compare and contrast the different forms of folklore that we study. They also help us better understand how we understand and navigate the world. However, if we aren't careful with genres, they can cause us to inadvertently limit the way that we perceive and think about folklore. But the sheer variety and the challenges that are associated with studying genre just makes them so much more interesting. This has been an episode of The Folklore Tree. Feel free to like and subscribe and like us on Facebook. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.